Okay, so this morning we're gonna try to install this lift kit, front and rear, and I'm probably gonna see if I could go take you through the steps that are necessary. The back should be pretty simple, but the front is gonna be a little bit more involved. Took me a while to figure out how to adjust that camber plate, but I did it on one side already, just so when I explain this to you I wouldn't be learning as I go. But yeah, here we go. Okay, so here's the strut tower. So first thing I gotta do is I gotta remove these three nuts, which I think are a 12mm socket, and this dust cap, which just snaps off. Just remove that with a flathead screwdriver. Then the next step would be to widen this hole with a sheet metal drill bit. The reason for that is to adjust our camber plate, we're gonna need to put a socket in there, and right now there is no room. So so when I remove these three nuts, the strut should just drop right out. But what I gotta do first is put a jack underneath the arm, the lower suspension arm, so that it doesn't fall to the floor. Okay, so I got the strut pulled down. So basically the top of the strut has these three studs. So I'm gonna bolt that onto my lift kit piece, which is basically the spacer. So you see it's got like triangulated footprint, which kind of matches this mounting plate on the strut itself. So that's gonna mount onto there. And at the top of the strut tower, I'm going to mount this from the underside using new hardware, which I have here. Also high strength bolts, high strength nuts. So these are actually nylon inserted nuts, so they're like a lock nut. For installing the adapter, the spacer, I'm actually just going to use the factory hardware that was used to mount to the strut tower. And that hole there, this one needs to be widened so that once the kit is installed, I could move that stud you see there on the slot and then tighten the nut that goes into that stud. This is too small now, so I need to widen it with a drill bit, and I think this is a 1-inch diameter. It's the biggest one I have, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so I'm running into a problem. Where I put my jack stand, it's interfering with this control arm. Basically, it's hitting the jack there, and it's not letting me push the suspension arm down far enough to get this to tuck underneath the strut tower. Also, one thing, if you ever do something like this, make sure to disconnect the brake line. What happens is when you drop down the suspension, it puts too much stress on the brake line. You can see it's kind of stretched as it is. So you got to disconnect it from this the bolt that kind of secures it to the strut. And once you got everything back in, don't forget to put that back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jack the car back up to move it a little bit away from that bar so that I could push this suspension down far enough for me to tuck the strut under there. Okay, so I got the bolts inserted from the bottom. These aren't tight yet, but I just wanted to show you, there's the camber adjustment bolt in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a socket that has a swivel end on it to try to tighten that. On the bottom here, when I pulled out the strut, I think I pulled the CV joint attachment at the front diff out too far, so I had to wrestle a lot with it to get it back in, and it was just a matter of aligning the splines. But you know, there's no visibility. One thing I did notice, something I have to do in the future, is the CV joint boot on the other side, on the, in this case it'll be the driver's side because it's the right side, has a tear in it. So I do have to replace the CV boots with, and repack it with grease. But that's a future project. Alright, so now I'm going to tighten everything up, and hopefully the front suspension should be done. Okay, so everything's installed. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna throw a like a paper towel in here and just spray the top of this with paint, just so we don't get any corrosion on this exposed metal that I drilled out. And I don't know if you noticed the silver stuff that I had in between the camber plate and the actual strut adapter, but I put a little bit of non-seizing compound just to prevent like water from building between the two layers and start to rust the components. So basically, I could call the front suspension done. Now the next step is to do the rear suspension. I believe the only thing I gotta do is replace over here in the back those two, I guess you could call them shackle arms. This metal piece here, there's two of them, one on each side of this leaf spring, and basically I'm just putting a longer one that has a 2-inch additional 2 inches from this bolt to this bolt. So basically this whole suspension will be lowered by 2 inches, which in fact will raise the whole rear end by 2 inches. Okay, so got the front wheels on with the spacers. It's kind of dark in there. Looks like it still has a little bit of positive camber, but I'm hoping that once I drive it and the suspension settles a little bit, it'll be at least 0 camber. I did turn the wheel with the car lifted to see if there was any binding on the axle, and there wasn't. So that's a telltale sign that you got too much positive camber and you're just asking for a CV joint failure. So at least I feel better that it didn't have any kind of binding. I turned the wheel with it lifted, like I said, with while the wheels were turned and straight, and everything was okay. So next I'm going to do the rear. So I got to replace these two supports with these guys. So I have multiple holes here. I think that was for some adjustability, because on the front the spacer, it's a 2-inch spacer, so you're going to get an automatic 2-inch lift. But on the rear, you're pivoting off of this front support. like this. So I don't know how much I need to increase that to get a 2-inch increase in the lift. So what I'm gonna do is, first I gotta find another way to jack it up, because right now this is on the rear axle, which is putting force on the spring. So if I were to remove that bolt, this would just, like, you know, smash forward. So I'm gonna see if I could put the jacks on somewhere on the chassis. I know I gotta find a jack point, and then what I'll do is I'll measure the travel, how much that has to travel for this to be 2 inches lower to the ground, which in turn will give me a 2-inch lift. Okay, so I was able to change the jacking points to basically, I guess this is the factory jacking point. I gotta read the manual, but it's basically just some stamped sheet metal that supports the front attachment of the leaf springs. And I am not gonna be able to lift the rear today because I removed the shackle, and I thought that the back of this is the back of the shackle, this is the front. So this ties to the chassis, this ties to the leaf spring, and it was, you know, you got a nut on top, one on the bottom. And I thought that these were separate bolts, so I thought I could reuse these, but it's a welded assembly. So this is all one piece. And these bushings are also pretty worn out. So I'm gonna have to try to get new bushings, and also actual bolts that will go through. Let me see if I can show you here. Through the leaf spring, through the attachment point on the chassis. Again, won't be able to do the rear lift today. So what I'll do is I'll just try to see if I can find that hardware, and, you know, come back to this part of it.